In the book of Mark, it says, as soon as the meal was finished, Jesus insisted that the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead across to Bethsaida while he dismissed the congregation. After sending them off, he climbed a mountain to pray. There are lots of moments in Jesus' ministry where he had to get away. You could see the kind of rhythm moving back and forth between the intensity of the teaching and the healing that he was doing, and then also finding time to be by himself, to go up on the mountain to pray, to be alone, to get himself centered, to bring himself close to God. And there's something about summer and the opportunities for shifting our patterns, being other places, that also allow us that kind of refreshment. So this morning, the three of us are going to tell you a little bit about what we learned on our summer vacations. The truth is, for me, that I don't exactly vacation. Actually, most of the traveling that I do is related to my work, which actually has a lot of playing in it. So you could look at it from the other point of view, which is that I'm always vacationing. But it does take me to other places, and 2 times this summer I had trips that took me close enough to the Midwest that I was able to go back to Bloomington, Indiana, where I grew up. This last trip, I was there just a week and a half or so ago, and I was staying with my brother and sister-in-law who lived just a little bit outside of Bloomington. So as I was driving back and forth doing the various things that I was doing, I was often making this trip from Bloomington to this slightly farther out little spot, 10 or 15 minutes away from the edge of Bloomington. So kind of a windy road going up and down through these soft hills that are characteristic of southern Indiana. And there was one point in particular where it was early evening. The sun was low in the sky was beautiful and blue, and this golden light was suffusing the entire landscape, and it's so green. And I realized how rare it is that I'm actually on a kind of a small winding road going through the middle of mostly green, uninterrupted by too many tall buildings. I spent a lot of time on the grid, and I just noticed in that particular time how different it was to be in that kind of landscape. And I've noticed several times in my life, returning to Indiana, and not just southern Indiana where I grew up, but northern Indiana where my grandparents were, that when I'm in those landscapes, I can feel that in my body in a completely different way than I experience, for example, the landscape of California, where I've been for a long time, but I didn't grow up here. So I find this area beautiful, but there's a kind of resonance in that geography that I experience when I'm in southern Indiana that speaks not just to kind of the aesthetics of the beauty of the place, but also that deeper sense of belonging and being home.
I think what I learned on my summer vacation, I got to spend a lot of time outside this summer, which was great. And as I was trying to boil it down to a simple statement, I think that what I learned was sometimes the most appropriate response to the awesomeness of God or the awesomeness of a moment is just to be silent and take it in. So part of what I did on vacation was I went up to the North Coast. I'd never really been up there, even though I've lived in California for, 12, 15 years or so now. I've never been up to Mendocino, to Fort Bragg, to that area. So I spent a few days up there, and I was with a friend, and we were driving along, and we kept pulling over at the stops along Highway 1, and we'd get out of the car, and I'd go out, and I would just gasp, and I would say, oh my gosh, this is so incredible. And it was one of those weeks where it wasn't foggy at all. It was beautiful, and the blues were just incredibly vibrant, and there were birds, and the seals, and just all of the sensations. And I kept taking out my iPhone, right, and taking all these pictures. So we'd get back to the place we were staying at night, and I'd look at all the pictures, and I'd think, gosh, these all look exactly the same. They just are amazing, and I'd want to post them on my Facebook, and I was just like, okay, this just looks like I was in the same place, taking the same picture. And I don't know, by the third day, where I realized that I was coming short of words that were synonyms to amazing and incredible and beautiful and awesome, I just stopped taking out my phone. I stopped trying to say anything at all, and I just took it in and tried to really just be there in that present moment and realize there were no words to capture how beautiful God's creation is, how incredibly privileged I felt to have the time and the ability to take time to be there, and to really try to just soak it into my body and not try to do anything with it, to tell anybody about it, to post it anywhere, to take it off into some meaningful way, to make a sermon about it necessarily, but just to let it be and to say thank you.
What I learned on my summer vacation. About a week before I went back to New England to see my family, I lost my watch. And so I kind of took that as a sign or maybe an invitation to enter into a different, an alternate relationship with time. I think going back, like Phil was saying, to your hometown, your home place, your home people can sometimes feel a bit like time travel anyway. And I found myself dipping into old rhythms of time, old rhythms of behavior, even, adolescent behaviors with parents, things like the inescapable too, but also the beautiful, the astounding lunch with my best friend from childhood, who I met, of all places, in church, who can still make me laugh in the same inexplicable way. I accidentally found myself on an archaeological dig in my parents' basement. We're in the midst of old, dried-up lip smackers and dance team ribbons and old, worn-out shoes. I found myself digging into layers of time, reconnecting with memories as they flooded back that I had completely forgotten. And I found myself aware of the cyclical nature of time in a different way that when I'm constantly rushing to appointments and determined by a schedule, you just don't enter into. I found myself scooping up my newly long-limbed nieces and nephews, and suddenly I was the one telling the children how much they've grown. Time was so cyclical, isn't it? I had dinner with my 92-year-old grandfather and got to meet his new girlfriend. And watched them smile at each other across the table like teenagers. Time is so cyclical. And I found myself, when I could let go of trying to grasp on to, like what Rachel was saying, trying to get the picture or capture the moment, that sense of time slipping by like sand in an hourglass, when I could loosen my grip a little and sink into deep Sabbath time, I felt what Abraham Joshua Heschel calls the sanctuary in time of Sabbath. Sabbath as a sanctuary in time, a holy space carved out, both separate, timeless, some taste of the eternal, and also somehow in time. And so when the vacation came to an end, I found myself gripping again in that homesick feeling of right before the first day of school, where you can't believe, where did the time go? And then, it sounds cliche, but why do we all take pictures of the sunset on vacation? There's this incredible beauty that is crystallized, and then you turn away and it's gone. There's something about the compression of time that lets us enter into the expansiveness of the eternal. Amen.
And this story from the book of Luke Every year, Jesus' parents traveled to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up as they always did for the feast. When it was over and they left for home, the child Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know it. Thinking he was somewhere in the company of pilgrims, they journeyed for a whole day and they began looking for him among relatives and neighbors. When they didn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem looking for him. The next day, they found him in the temple, seated among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. The teachers were all quite taken with him, impressed with the sharpness of his answers. Teaching was such an important part also of Jesus' ministry, and education, I think, has such a high value in this congregation. In this time when we're shifting into this September through whatever May phase, which often feels like a time of increased attention to learning and growing, we wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the people that had an influence on us as we think about who has been important to us in our own lives as teachers and leaders, to see how people like that have changed our lives, and to have you reflect a little bit for yourself about people in your own life, educators who have changed you.
I've had a lot of great teachers in my life, but Miss Judy Shannon, who taught 3rd grade at Honeywell School, was destined to be my favorite teacher. She was already the favorite teacher of 2 out of 3 of my older brothers who'd had her. In fact, I think she was everyone's favorite teacher at Honeywell School, but it didn't make it any less special. She went by Miss Judy Shannon. Miss Shannon, we called her, but on all our homework assignments and worksheets, she signed it MJS, Miss Judy Shannon, sometimes with a smile or a heart. Miss Judy Shannon made you feel good. She was irreverent and a little madcap. She used to tell us all that she looked really good for over 100. When, in retrospect, she clearly couldn't have been more than about 60, but she did look good. Miss Judy Shannon could get you excited about anything, whether it was what she called studying a near place or a far place. So we learned about Boston, and then we learned about Russian czars and czarinas. She could get you excited about long division or drawing your name in cursive, and she was... What I remember most about her is that she gave me tons of permission. She let me do skits, my first foray into comedy, after recess, simply because I asked. And then she said yes again and again and again. Miss Judy Shannon also gave me permission or invitations, even that I didn't notice until looking back in retrospect. There was a boy in our class who looked a little bit different and spoke a little bit different, and I could have easily slipped into a kind of complacent laughter behind his back with many other kids in the class, but Miss Judy Shannon assigned me to sit next to him, an invitation to be kind. And in her example and her exuberant joy, I still feel an invitation to be joyful, to be kind.
Like Kit, I've been lucky to have tons of really great teachers, but the person who kept coming up for me when Phil invited us to think about favorite teachers was Mrs. Kapinski. And I can just picture her. It's been a long time now. She was our 10th and 11th grade language arts special reading teacher, and she was remarkable in lots of ways, but I think the thing that makes me think of her right now in the summer is remembering how she loved reading so much, And it wasn't like she instilled that love of reading in me. I mean, that I got from reading with my mom, from, as soon as I was born, I'm sure. But Mrs. Kopinski loved reading so much, and she was so excited whenever she saw any of us reading. It didn't matter what we were reading. So she was equally, universally exuberant about whether someone came into class reading a comic book, reading Catcher in the Rye, reading the Bible, reading, a newspaper, reading a cereal box. I mean, whatever it was that was drawing your attention to the written word, she was excited about. And she was also a person who had zero concern about whether or not she was cool. And so, when you're in 10th and 11th grade, at least for me, there's a lot of preoccupation about whether or not you're cool. And so to meet this person who was so clearly cool, because she had no lack of concern about that, was just instilled in my brain, and particularly around words. Like, she just was so infectious in her excitement that it gave me permission, it was a lot of permission, for me to be the reading geek that I was. Full on, full force, whatever I happened to be reading, it just gave so much permission for that, which has been just a source of joy and strength in my life. And particularly, also, she was the person who really helped me to bring that to poetry in a way that was really not cool when you're in junior high and high school, at least in my school. But she saw that in me and nurtured that in me and encouraged my own sad attempts at poetry and introduced me to a ton of poets. And so I'm so grateful for her, for how much she loved reading, that she had no judgment about what was good to read, what was worth reading, but like just reading in general, and particularly the way that language can work in a magical way in poetry. So I'm just grateful for her today.
One of my favorite teachers was also my third grade teacher. Geneva Burt taught third grade at Elm Heights Elementary School, which was just a few blocks from where I lived. And she would have been a relatively young teacher when I had her, I think. And this would have been in the early 60s. And she had created what later would probably be called an open classroom. It's an incredibly creative teacher, and also an artist herself, and an encourager of artistic projects. It seemed like there was always something creative going on in her classroom. And that was one of the first places where I started to realize how much fun that was for me to play in that way. But there are other parts of it that where we were allowed to kind of move at our own pace educationally, which was also a really helpful sort of thing for me at that particular time in my life. So I just remember that classroom being lively and fun and not too strict and structured, but full of possibilities for how kids could learn, and that all of the different ways of learning were important. I remember at one point during the year, we incubated chicken eggs and hatched chickens. And I don't think this happened the year that I had her, but she would often have a lamb in her classroom, a lamb in a diaper, of course. And she was a great believer in children having those kinds of direct, hands-on experiences. I remember the eggs, we had to turn them in the incubator, every now and again, and there was an arrow on one side, and we had to remember whether the arrow was supposed to be up or down. When I was an undergraduate, I was doing a special project in education and creativity, and Geneva was still teaching at a different elementary school, and I actually went back and spent a semester serving kind of as an informal student teacher with her. So that was interesting as perhaps a junior or senior in college, to go back and spend another a few months with her and to see how she was teaching at that point, and to reflect on what that had meant for me. Looking back on it, I can realize that was my first kind of intersecting between art and education, which is a theme that's played out throughout my life. And was actually able to tell her that sometime later, because she ended up living at the same retirement community where my mom lived. So as recently as a year or two ago, I have seen her, and I would see her on occasion when I was visiting in Bloomington. So interesting to have this woman who was such an inspiration to me, who opened up a lot of possibilities for me in terms of what could be done in a classroom, and the various ways that she encouraged my own art and education, and that continued well beyond third grade. I hope you'll be able to spend some time this morning or throughout this week reflecting a little bit on this shift that we're in between the summertime and the fall, to be able to notice the deep places that you've experienced in your own summertime, however you spent your summer, to be thinking about the phase that we're moving into, and again, whether you're on an educational schedule or not, to recognize the importance of learning and education, which of course is very much a part of this church, and to celebrate this time of transition.